question has been a subject of maybe 2.5 years of research that I co-led with colleagues on the Economic Research Forum for the Middle East. And the answer is simple. It depends on what kind of inequality that you're looking at. So inequality is a very complex subject. You have inequalities in outcomes, things that you see happening, but also you have inequalities in opportunities, the underlying factors that lead to these outcome changes. You also have inequalities in gender, you have inequalities in income, you have inequalities spatial, you have inequalities in wealth, you have all kinds of different inequalities. So it's a rather complex subject, and that's why we have to be careful when we talk about inequality to be specific in what kind of inequality that we're addressing. So let me start with the income inequality story. Well, up until recently, the standard story would get, well, just by looking at the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of income inequality that is mostly applied by economists and social scientists. The story you would get is that the region has relatively low inequality. So the Gini index is lower than the global average. And then people like Thomas Piketty come along and they say, no, that's not true, because when you factor in other sources of income, when you look at the data differently, the region becomes the highest inequality worldwide. And the same thing happens when you look at other sources of information, like wealth, for example. When you look at wealth inequality, and you look at the dynamics recently, post-COVID, you see that the region has been picking up in terms of wealth inequality. So if one were to summarize the ongoing narrative on inequality, it would be as follows. There certainly seems to be an agreement that inequality in income and wealth is much higher than initially thought. And there seems to be an agreement that it has been increasing over the years. So now, there are many reasons for that, but one of the reasons, the most important reason I would say, is because of the nature of economic growth not favoring the vast majority of the population. So if you look at the median, the average person in the region, and look at their wealth, it's actually declined by almost 1/3 over the past 5 years or so. And that's a staggering figure. I mean, that really shows you that there are people who have been left out of the growth process. So, meanwhile, when you look at inequalities in outcomes in basic indicators like health, education, access to water, sanitation, infant mortality, you look at the differences between rich and poor, it's a success story. So on the other hand, you see that there has been progress done on certain types of inequalities. Gender disparities have been reduced, not in terms of quality or access to quality, but just these basic indicators. But there's a third story. When you look at the opportunities, and the inequality in opportunities for many of these indicators is still very high. And still the wealth of the individual, the household, family wealth, the place of residence play a significant role in explaining these outcomes that we see. So it's a very mixed story, but certainly I would say that the overall detachment between what we see in the social side and the improvements that we see on the social front and between the economic side is quite important for a policy perspective, that the region really needs to work a lot more on its economic policies to bring it to become more inclusive so that they capitalize on the human development that has taken place, even if it has significant deficits still in quality. That hasn't taken place because of many reasons, including the rentier nature of the Arab economy. So there are many more issues that I can talk about in terms of the inequality, but I think one last statistic that I would like to say, just to show you a bit on the solutions, the possible solutions. If you were to take the richest 10% of the Arab population and you were to measure their wealth, and you were to ask a question, how much of their wealth would be needed to close the poverty gap? it would amount to, in most countries, middle-income countries, no more than 1 or 1.5%. What does that mean? It means that the money and the resources are there to be able to respond to huge challenges like the poverty challenge, which is, by the way, the only region in the world where poverty has increased since 2013, regardless of how you measure it, is the Arab region. So it's not a question of resources. The wealth is there. It's really a question of governance and economic policies and the ability of institutions to implement these policies. That would be my final statement.